Okay, so welcome everyone. Let's start with this last afternoon session of the 18th Granada Seminar. Thank you very much to all of you for staying until the end. And it is my pleasure to have here Edina Rosta from University College London. And she's going to talk about enhanced sampling simulations of biomolecular systems. Thank you very much, Edina.
Or this, can I use this one? Because I think this might be easier for me. Okay, thank you. So thank you so much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here. I really love Granada. It's an amazing, beautiful city, and it's very nice to be here again. And I think my talk would maybe have slightly more applications. So I just wanted to introduce the kinds of problems that we have been working on for a long time. So I hope you bear with me at the very initial bit of my presentation, which would be about the application part. Just to give you a little bit of perspective and insight about what is it that we are trying to do. So I have been long interested in phosphate catalytic enzymes. So these are proteins that catalyze the bond breakage of phosphate. And so you may or may not remember from your chemistry classes what phosphates are, but when it comes to their chemistry, they are super boring. You only have phosphorus and oxygen atoms forming or breaking bonds between each other. But it just turns out that this very boring reaction is really probably the most important chemical reaction you can think of when it comes to biology. And I think probably you already know many of these examples, or some of these examples if you have either from the research or even just from general knowledge, that phosphate catalytic enzymes are in all life forms, in all essential processes, very important. So, for example, when you think of creating or making DNA or RNA, when you think of molecular machines like metals in the cells, they use ATP-ADP equilibrium that has to do with one breaking or forming between ATP in the ATP molecule to create ADP. Or in signaling, when very bad diseases like cancer happen very often, signaling systems that have to do with phosphorylation have some malfunction, and that causes the cancer. And even in cases where we have, for example, metabolic enzymes that would create some kind of molecules, like bacteria would create some sort of complex molecules, many of the times, even if the final molecule has no phosphate, the intermediate steps would have some activated species that would use phosphate. So they are very important in all life forms as we know it. And yet it's not so easy to model them. So what we do in my group, we model them using a so-called QMMM calculation. So we have a small active site which is described by quantum chemistry and quantum mechanics using DFT calculations for the most part. And then the rest of the system is described by classical force fields. And normally we would have to be able to account for what happens exactly for every single atom in this active site, and also for the dynamics of this large complex system. So it has a lot of complexity, these calculations, and they are also very time consuming. And one of the difficulties, for example, is to account for the protons, which are experimentally not visible, but we have to account for them. I'm not going to go into that detail, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about magnesium ions. These magnesium ions are almost always involved in these reactions, and they are also important in various drugs. They oftentimes coordinate drug molecules, and I will tell you a little bit about this one example here later for HIV infections. Well, what we wanted to do is we wanted to just get a general picture of how important are these specific enzymes when we consider all possible enzymes that we would have in biological systems. And so when we looked at these database of the enzyme function numbers that kind of delineate all of the different enzyme reactions that is known currently, we find that 65% of the enzymes involve some sort of a phosphate-containing molecule in their active sites or substrates. And then more than half of these reactions have to do with triphosphate processing enzymes. So more than half of them would have exactly three phosphates, so not just one or two or four or five, but exactly three. And these three phosphates would be either broken between the second and the third, or between the first and the that accounts for 99% of these NTP, which I call this NTP nucleoside triphosphate. So it would account for 99% of these NTP processing enzymes, and only in very rare cases the bond breakage would happen here. So they are clearly very important. And then we wanted to understand what is the structural requirements for the magnesium ions in these enzymes. So we find that magnesium is very often essential, and we wanted to understand what magnesium does. And our hypothesis was, after looking at many of these cases, that the magnesium would coordinate two of the phosphates between which the bond is broken. So it would coordinate, in this case, these last two phosphates, or here it would coordinate these two phosphates. So that was our hypothesis, and we call it the magnesium pinch motif. Here is some examples with atomistic. So this is what we wanted to test, if this hypothesis is true or not. And so to do that, we wanted to look at both the structure of these enzymes and also the function. So we had to look at different data quantities. We of course can take the protein data bank, which is all of the experimentally resolved crystal structures, but we also have additional resources which would characterize these in terms of their fold, and we also can generate structures of unknown sequences using AlphaFold or Boltz or other similar machine learning based methods. And then we also have the function, which is not actually the best database one has because it has many errors. I think I skipped the errors for now because it's probably too much detail. But we basically can really look at overall more than 10,000 reactions that are all of these different enzyme databases. So we have done that, and we have kind of came to the conclusion that for the most part, there would be a type of fold defined by superfamilies, and these superfamilies all have a very similar coordination in terms of the coordination. So you can see here the different colors, although there are some slight variations in the structure, but overall it's really similar, and we can assign a representative structure for a given superfamily. So then what we wanted to do is identify all of these superfamilies, and that's what we did, and we characterized them in terms of their chemical reaction between the last two phosphates or between the first two phosphates, and then some extra superfamilies. And so for the most part, we had no exceptions, but in some cases where we had some difficulties, and maybe I just mentioned in one of them just so that we can talk a little bit of that later. So I asked a student in my group to find one of the high impact papers that would have a high resolution structure experimentally for an ATPase. And so he came up with the structure that was published in Science. And in this case, this was the ion, and this ion only coordinates this last phosphate. Actually, it didn't have the negative leakage. But when we looked a little bit more of the structure, we noticed that this distance was not the typical magnesium oxygen distance, but a little bit longer. So we thought this must be a calcium ion, and then we looked more in the literature, and we find this paper from 2007, a couple of years later, where they actually say that indeed that the crystal structure, instead of having the magnesium, it had a calcium. And then even a few years later, there was another paper done by a different group which was able to get the crystal structures in a magnesium, and then that one had the right coordination between the compound. The second and the third magnesium phosphate was the we think that should be the right one, having this magnesium conjugate. So we don't have this type of inaccuracy across all of the different databases, but by and large, we see that our hypothesis is true for the large majority of these enzymes. And I will skip now the exceptions. And what we also can say is that by doing some quantum mechanical calculations using DFT calculations, we can find what the role of this magnesium ion is. And what we can see is that if we keep the magnesium in the active site, we have a barrier for the reaction, which would be the transition state barrier, which I'm not sure everyone is familiar with that concept. Or maybe I hope maybe most of you will be familiar with that. So we would have kind of a reaction barrier that would translate directly to the ring. That would be normal for an enzyme, and if we remove the charge of the ion but keep everything else geometrically the same, we will see that this barrier goes up. So what that means is that the structure is not the most important aspect, but it's that polarization, how a magnesium draws the electron density of that highly charged phosphate. So we think that's the reason for this, and we can characterize them under using chemical foundation. So now this is just to summarize. So as you can see, there is many very important enzymes essentially in all life processes that catalyze some sort of molecular like glyphosate cleavage or transfer. And we identify this magnetic motif which is there in most of these enzymes, and we think that the role of the magnesium is to polarize its phosphate. So now I just give you one example of one of these systems, and this is that HIV integrase example as I mentioned before. So HIV integrase is one of the best drugs, inhibitors are some of the best drugs made. AIDS patients take this for 20 plus years and they have very little side effects. And these inhibitors directly coordinate the magnesium ion and nevertheless, because patients take it for so long, there are resistance. So, for example, for the first generation compounds, there is a double mutation here, which means two of these residues that was normally uh, glutamine and the lysine is substituted to two other residues, which is not actually very close to this drug molecule. And it affects the coordination to the magnesium and thereby this interaction here at the other side. So to characterize that, we look specifically at this water molecule, which is nicely placed here in the wild type, and is slightly displayed here in this double. And what we can see, even in like around 100 nanosecond long molecular dynamic simulation, is that in this double mutant, the water molecule leaves the system and there is new water coming in, shown here in different colors. So the system gets very flexible, whereas if we keep the white type, then we have a very stable coordination of this water molecule. So this is what we can do currently with a molecular dynamics simulation. We can kind of probe the stability of the system to maybe hundreds of nanoseconds, maybe microseconds. But to really run these simulations much longer to reach a biologically important time scale, we just don't have long enough simulations unless we bias the system or we do something special with the system. So then what we have to do is we have to modify the underlying force field by adding some additional potential to this force field to enable us to see the interesting events that we want to identify. So for example, if we would run our human simulations in the reactant state, we would be stuck here for a very long time and we would not see it cross to, let's say, the product state of our reaction. So, so to enable observing events on this product state, or to enable observing this pathway, there have been bias simulations developed for a long time ago, uh, and one of these is called umbrella sampling. And so the idea here is that we have our original potential, that would be let's say our minimum potential, and then we would add some additional biasing potentials, in this case some harmonic potentials, at specific regions of our reaction coordinate, so that when it's, and this is our transition state here, so then even when it's at our transition state, we would still be able to sample this region. It would be non-metastatic state before any replacement of its bias. So we would add these biasing potentials, and then we could look at the combination of these parallel simulations, which would be running parallel, and we would then analyze the histogram of how many times we are in a given group along this reaction coordinate. So what we would then do is then we would discretize this reaction coordinate into very small groups, and then we would ask the question in a given simulation how many times we were in a given group. And that is this method that has been developed called weighted histogram analysis method, which works very well and allows us to reconstruct this original unknown free energy profile from prepared by simulations. However, if we consider now our simulations that were run here, we could just reshuffle over our trajectories and we would get exactly the same histogram count. So the way we analyze this, we would get this histogram count in subgroup I in bias simulation K, and then we would write down the maximum likelihood problem of what would be our most likely unbiased probability of each of these. So if we would just reshuffle our dynamical trajectories, we would still arrive to the same histogram count in a given link, and therefore we lose all the dynamical information that we perform in analysis. So we thought, well, maybe it would be interesting to try to keep some of this kinetic information, which is there in our trajectories, and how could we do that? And so to do that, we can use something called microstate models. I think we already heard a couple of examples here for geometric metrics, so hopefully I don't have a very good introductory slide for this. But I just wanted to tell you that this is, of course, the master equation. We have seen this before. To get to this state from our biomolecular simulations, traditionally, what people would do, they would run their molecular dynamics simulations with organisms present, and then they would cluster these different configurations that they see, and they would get some kind of a coarse grained picture of these simulations. That would be their coarse grained master equation or Markov state model, eventually, which could get to like a two-state model where we would simply talk about, let's say, folded and non-folded process. So this would be a simple picture of what we would do. However, in our case, we don't want to get to this very coarse grained picture because we have our finely discretized coordinates. And so what we can do, we can use a similar approach. We can take our finely discretized coordinates and we can ask what is the most likely underlying Markov model that would give us back an unbiased Markovian system from our biased histogram transitions. So instead of building histograms of how many times we have an event bin, it would be a histograms of transitions, how many times we jump from one bin to another. And so then that would be our um, biased transition probabilities. And then to relate that to our unbiased transition probability, we use this approximation, which is varied for very short times, um, where we use here our bias in Bj and so we would then be able to get our unbiased Markov matrix, and I think all of you know it from the eigenvectors of this Markov matrix that belongs to eigenvalue 1. We would get the free energy profile, and we would get the probabilities of the stationary probabilities of our system. So the free energy profile, I showed before. And then we also get kinetic information. So we can get from the second eigenvalue, we can get the kinetic information that corresponds to the system. So we actually have that more information than what we would just normally get from the vector histogram analysis. And so just to show you some simple example of how this would work in some cases where we could initiate trajectories near the top of this area, somewhere in this position. And if we just initiate simple Monte Carlo trajectories here, some of them would go back to this valley and some of them would go down to this valley. So if we would see this type of time series as a function of time in these simulations. So now if we try to analyze that with the two methods, if we use the weighted histogram analysis method, it would see that there is a very large proportion of the simulation starting in this transition state position. So it would think that that's kind of relatively low in frequency. And so we would get this type of free energy profile, which is not derived from. Whereas if we use the transition probabilities that we derive from these simulations, we can actually correctly construct the original free energy profile. Now this is a bit more tricky when we have an inertial dynamics, but for now for Monte Carlo this works really well. And then the next question we wanted to ask that traditionally people would use these Markov models just to identify large like metastable states. However, we very often are interested in that key rate determining transition state. So when we do quantum chemistry, we would want to identify these molecular species that are called transition states, just because that gives us the information about the kinetics. That tells us what's that rate limiting step that the system typically has to overcome. I mean, most of these systems would have only one of these transition states. So we want to really understand what that looks like, and we want to be able to characterize that. And whereas we can do it for like a quantum chemical system, which is relatively small, or these large biological systems, where we have these complex processes, it's really not typically done. It's actually not so easy to get. So how could we do that? So what we can do is that we can start with our finely discretized Markov state model, and then we can start to cluster these states together. And if we, for example, cluster it into three states, then we would identify this event, for example, in this case. And if we have one more state, if we cluster this into four states, then what we found is that the second type of dynamical clustering could identify us this very short but key transition state as one of the network that would be the most relevant node. And then we cluster into, of course, into one or four clusters. So now again, the problem here is that we typically have very high dimensional systems, and to be able to do this type of clustering, or even to be able to construct our microstate model, it essentially becomes unfeasible for very large dimensions. So we typically need to pick our low-dimensional coordinates to be able to construct it. But nevertheless, what we can see is that we identify transition states in several systems. We can construct these networks, and one of these key network nodes, the transition state, will become very important, more important than splitting one of the metastable states into two states. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about course how we go about this. So what we're going to do is we want to do a type of a kinetic coarse graining of our network. So there are many coarse graining methods, for example, modularity, that, that does coarse graining based on just the neighborhood information, but does not take into account the actual kinetic information which we have and go between the different edges of this network. So then, how could we take into account the kinetic information? And so one of the ways is we could ask the question that if we reduce our network into a smaller network, then maybe we want to be sure that our transition counts between these networks is the same as summing up the microscopic transition counts. So that's sort of our correlation functions match between the original and the coarse-grained network at a given lifetime. Of course, this cannot be done for all lifetimes, but we can pick a given lifetime and we can make sure that in that lifetime it will match. So this is something we can easily do. Or we could also say that maybe we don't know exactly what we're going to pick. So in that case, we could pick the integral of all lifetimes from 0 to infinity, and Hammer and Sabo actually came up with a closed form expression that if we do this type of clustering, if we enforce this kind of relationship between our clustered and the microscopic correlation function, then this would be the corresponding rate matrix, or also we can write down the corresponding Markov rate matrix. So this rate matrix sometimes called the Markov rate matrix. So we basically can have a closed form expression of what this should be for a given clustering. However, this is how we would define the dynamics on these clusters, but there is also another problem that we have to solve, is how we actually do the clustering. Which nodes are we going to put together in one of these coarse-grained nodes, which is in general an anti-hard problem. Especially if we try to have very large clusters, we would have an exponentially large number of options on how we put these together. So that's a difficult problem. Now, besides, let's say we want to keep this equation, so besides keeping this dynamics, then we can ask the question, what would be the best clustering? So for any given clustering, we can make sure this happens. And then we can ask which one is the best clustering. Now, to do that, we would have to pick some sort of an objective function. And of course, then we want to pick some kind of a kinetic objective function. And what has been proposed is to use the second eigenvalue, which is kind of gives us the slowest relaxation time in the system. So we can pick the second eigenvalue, and that can be shown that it's a variation of quantity. And we can also pick the second and third relaxation times, or the sum of these relaxation times. In fact, what we can actually interestingly found, if we sum up all the relaxation time, we arrive to something called the Hamming constant, which is a very interesting quantity because it can actually be related to mean first passage times. So mean first passage time is the average time it takes from some starting state I to reach first reach state J. So that's a mean first passage time here. And this Hamming constant, it can be shown that it's not only the sum of all relaxation times in this kind of kinetic networks, but it's also equal to this sum of these weighted mean first passage time that are weighted by the target state J, the equilibrium population of the target state J. And so this is independent of I, so that's why it's a constant. And in fact, at some point there has been some prize offered if someone can explain what is kind of a physical intuition behind this question, why is this actually independent of this high? So this is a quite interesting, nice quantity. And also this calculus has been used, which was we try to optimize your storage relaxation time, and that's probably the most important process in the system, and at very long times that would be the determinant for your two-state system. So what we have done is we try to then look at using the tuning constant, and then we define this variation quantity where we could relate our um, Cumming constant for the full system to the Cumming constant of the four-state system. And interestingly, what we find is that for complex enough systems, the optimal boundary by minimizing this difference here, so by trying to maximize this force range Cumming constant, what we get is that the optimal boundary is related to kind of equal round trip times between these clusters. So that's a quite interesting result that we found. And then we also wanted to see how it works in practice. So we constructed some simple linear networks. This is a linear network where this is what potential of mean force. So this is the free energy profile corresponding to that linear network that can be turned into some sort of a kinetic quantity. So what we can see is that another method that people have been using, the microstate community have been using, is PCCA, which is actually a fantastically good method. It's also using kinetic space clustering, and it's very, very fast. And it would identify these four clusters in this case. Now, if we use modularity doesn't know anything about the kinetics of the system. So it would just divide this linear network into four equal parts, which then you can see is really bad. It doesn't reflect the actual true physical nature of this network. So modularity here would be a very bad choice. If we use the Cumming constant, we arrive to the same result as PCCA. So it identifies all these key metastable states which are here, even this tiny one. Now, if we optimize for the second relaxation time, and we're going to find four states, interestingly, what that tells us, there are really only three important metastable states in this system. And the fourth state ends up being this tiny transition state that would separate our lowest energy valley from the rest of the system. So it would kind of identify this barrier for a two-state like system. So this is just to illustrate what is the difference where the Cumming constant tries to identify and match all of the slow relaxation times. This Tau2 only cares about the most important slowest relaxation. Now, we also tried this on some more complex systems, but the most complex was this pentapeptide that is a benchmark in IMO that is quite frequently used for microscope models. And what we can see in this case, PCCA differs from our semi-constant optimization, not by much, but some of the nodes visibly are not where they should be in this in PCCA clustering. Nevertheless, this is really fast to evaluate. So we think that for larger systems, the Cumming constant optimization would give us more physically important clustering of the network. Nevertheless, it's slightly more expensive to perform this clustering. And in fact, to try to see if we could go to some sort of machine learning model where we could be able to do this clustering a bit faster, we tried various graph neural networks based architectures. We really tried very hard with all sorts of different decoders and, and different layers where we would that would define the properties of each node. However, it did not work very well in our hands. So basically, we find that originally this architecture was proposed by some scientists in Stanford and Google, and they have used it for the clustering of very large networks. And what we find is that it has not worked very, very well in our case. In fact, some very simple method that we have developed before was better on the Caldwell-based algorithms. So at this point, maybe just to summarize this bit, we can cluster networks, kinetic networks, quite efficiently, and we can reduce the dimensionality that way. It's very important to use kinetic objective functions if these networks are incorporated from the type of simulations that we are doing. And what we can do is we can use, for example, first passage times, and interestingly, these optimal clusters in that case would lead to equal runtime times between the force brain clusters. But numerical optimization for very large networks is not. Um, so maybe now just wanted to show you a few applications of how we use the macroscope models. So for example, this was a collaboration with Novartis. They were interested in how long a drug molecule takes to cross the membrane. This is particularly important as there are very few drugs that are able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So it's a very important problem to be able to design drugs that can cross the blood-brain barrier and reach the brain also for healing the brain diseases. So for them, it was a very interesting question to know what is the kinetics of a drug crossing a certain type of membrane. They have used 7 different drug molecules, and they identified this potential of the force for crossing the membrane. And they also had experimental information, so they had to use umbrella sampling simulations together with uh, molecular dynamics that was not biased to be able to get some kind of rate. And what with our method, they were able to use only the umbrella sampling, which is about 10 times faster. So we got very good correlation. And what we also could actually check is that, well, if we look at our rates that we get out of the second eigenvalue of our Markov chain model, and we look at the barrier height that we would get out of our first eigenvector of this Markov matrix, then by these two quantities, we can determine what this prefactor is to say, which typically in quantum computer calculations, we could just take it as kT over h, which is around this much. And so what we could say is that in these simulations, they were really orders of magnitude different. So sometimes it can be very important to actually find out this prefactor because it's not always guaranteed that we will get the average. Other examples that we have tried is an intermolecular electron transfer where there is a molecule here and an electron shifts from one side of the molecule to the other. And in this case, for example, we find that this kT over h is in very good agreement with the prefactor that we get from our simulation. So in this case, we could just use standard quantum chemistry approximation that we got. But in any case, this is a nice example of trying to do something that is very hard to define a reaction coordinate. But I don't want to go too much into detail. Just wanted to mention. So we also can use it for enzyme reactions. And we use this, the only approximations we had is Evans-Polanyi principle, sort of to relate the biased and unbiased rate matrices or Markov matrices to each other in this formula, which is actually a very good approximation. So we were quite happy with this. However, for now, we have not actually tried to drive the simulations ourselves. So we would be given a bias simulation already, and we would just analyze that simulation. But we are not actually the ones to actually drive the simulation. So then we ask the question, could we actually try and use this type of information to drive the simulations? And so oftentimes we have some kind of a starting state for a protein, and we want to find another state, like an active inactive transition, for example. So in that case, we would like to find how could we go from some starting state I to some end state J, so that we would minimize the inverse transition, so that we get there as fast as we can. And then we can ask the question, what kind of bias should we apply on the system to minimize the mean first passage time from going from I to J for a given protein. So that's the kind of biasing strategy we developed. And what we can see in here, we want to bias the system from an initial point here to a target state here. And depending on the position of the particle, we would have to apply different bias. And as you can see, this original potential has some kind of hills that were difficult to overcome. This mean first passage time optimized bias would result in an overall downhill slope. So that would be very hard to reach the target state. So this is, and we can also do this in higher dimension, for example, to reach saturation. So this is just an example. If we would compare this to something like metadynamics, you can see that we are quite a bit faster because what metadynamics does, it tries to fill up all the valleys, but then it will visit every single state along the way and not directly specific to our target state. So the advantage of this method would be that we can more directly reach the target state with our optimal bias rather than visiting and filling up all possible values, which would be very expensive in high dimensions. If just to illustrate this, we applied it to something like small molecule phosphate unbinding from this protein following the reaction. So let's say to break this bond. and afterwards we try to push the straight out of the binding pocket. And along the way, we can identify this unbinding pathway, and we can see what are the key interactions that this phosphate is making for interactions protein interactions. We can analyze these interactions, and we can see that many of these residues are very highly conserved. So just to summarize this bit, we can drive these simulations using mean per passage time optimized files, which actually can work quite well. But even here, we would have issues with the high dimensional microscope models. But nevertheless, we find very interesting biological insights. And what we are trying to do now is to ask the question, well, could we make this more automated, and could we use some sort of reinforcement learning? It's work in progress, and I have to say this is really hard. This reinforcement learning agent that we are learning. Um, so maybe just one last topic. How much time? Okay, so I'll be very quick. So another problem is, in general, vegan non-binding is a very important problem, and typically people thought before that the binding constant itself is a key quantity. You could optimize drugs for how strong they bind, but it has been a paradigm shift to say, well, maybe in some cases it's not the binding strength itself, but it's how long the ligand actually stays bound. So it's this off rate, which is the residence time of this drug, which is the really important question. And so here we try to look at what would be the key interactions that this ligand is making at the transition state of this unbinded process. That would be the determinant of this off rate and determine the residence time. So to do that, this is an illustration of what we normally would do. We would take different drug molecules. For which we have experimental numbers, we try to do an umbrella sampling simulation, but we very much underestimate the barrier. We get way too fast unbinding rates. So the reason is because this is a low-dimensional coordinate, and it doesn't properly reflect the complexity of this unbinding simulations. So then what we wanted to do then is to identify important collective variables along the way to better describe this path. So we would run many of these simulations, and then during the way we would identify every single interaction that the ligand encounters with the protein. And we even can run several of these unbinding trajectories where we could identify these interactions that would be very with many different interactions between the ligand and the protein. And then instead of using the simple umbrella sampling, we can use something called the finite temperature strain method, where we would look at this one-dimensional path in this very high-dimensional space, and we determine the minimum free energy path in this high-dimensional space. So what we would normally do is we start with an initial path, we run umbrella sampling simulations kind of in each of these windows, and then we adaptively optimize the positions of these windows so that the forces are parallel to the path itself. And we always redistribute the images so that they can overlap properly. And what we have done here in addition is that we also introduced Hamiltonian replica exchange between these images, allows the equilibration and doesn't add any extra cost. So with that, we could determine some kind of free energy profiles, and that allowed us to identify transition states near the transition state here. And then we asked the question, okay, it's very nice we know what these transition states are more or less, but what is the important part of these transition states? Why are they so important? What is the key collective variable that will determine these transition states? So then what we did, similarly to the example I've shown you before, we would run down the trajectories. We start them here, and some go back to the bound state, some go down to the unbound state. And then we built some machine learning models that would classify these outcomes. Either they would be in or they would be out. And then we would check, we would try to predict at the very beginning of the simulation, is it going to be in or out? So at the very beginning, they are so close to the transition state structure that basically by looking at it by eye, we cannot really distinguish them. You can see the red and blue colors are completely interchanged. But nevertheless, if we pick structures from here, the machine learning model was able to identify these to something like 80% accuracy. whether it's going to be an in or an out outcome. And then we ask what kind of feature importance is derived from this to kind of help us understand what was the key interaction that the event was making with the change. So just to give you one example, this was um, GPCR protein, which is very important for the discovery. We identified this unbinding pathway, which looks very similar for three different drugs. And then interestingly, this shows us the feature importance, the top bit, and this lower bit shows us with the neural network model kind of how much accuracy we lose if we remove certain features. So it's very similar to a feature importance here, but this is a kind of accuracy drop. We could have also used different values like this Shapley formula or some other kind of ways of identifying feature importances. But what we really like the most is this feature importance value, and they are by and large identify similar regions. And what we have found is that the most important feature here was a residue which is on the other side of the protein. And what is very interesting is that this protein binds something on this side and then it signals down to the other side to actually implement some kind of a signaling reaction that would react to that binding. So it was very interesting that even though this residue was really far, and out of all the different residues this protein could have been picking, it actually picked this one, which was able then to identify these other chemical reactions. So this is just to summarize this week. So with this kind of approach, we can generate very short, very quick trajectories. We can build a machine learning model to classify the outcome, and then we identify key features that will tell us about what are important interactions that these drug molecules are making that would determine their response. And what we are currently trying to do is then to understand the duality between these different features, which is quite an interesting area. So not much applied to molecular simulations so far. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your patience to listen to this, and also for all the people who collaborated with us and those people from my group, and especially also Alessia Nibala, who actually did a lot of work. So basically, bias will be any if you take the potential but if you look at a diffusion, if you think of a diffusion process, this is how a given bias would change the transition probability. So you see that comes from the ratio of probability between the biased and unbiased system. And what is interesting is that it didn't duplicate the same percentage of systems, and now the percentage cancels out, and it becomes like 100 cases. So it's like a square root relationship. And, and so the bias is any kind of potential I add to the system. Normally, if I would have a probability distribution and I would bias my Hamiltonian with a given bias index, then the corresponding stationary probability is divided by an e to the minus u over kt factor, right? So that would be like a Boltzmann factor kind of, right? But if we think about a transition probability, then interestingly, it will be biased with this square root kind of relationship of the ratio of the two Boltzmann factors from the when you study this, jump from one of these states to another, right? So that would be like my transition probability at that given that time, right? And then if I wanted to do it on a fourth phase, then maybe I decide to cluster certain states together, and then I would count that, and I would ask at the same time how many times I jump from one to the other. So I have correlation functions. I can define these correlation functions for the microscopic state or for the macroscopic one, and I also can pick my estimate at which time I'm going to count what is that correlation. So, and this doesn't set up the problem. So let's say you would have your 120 by 120, and then I say, okay, now I have this big one, but I have a choice of how I talk to it in different states. And so then I have a very large choice actually, something like, I don't know, 120. Very big choice. So then I would try to ask the question, what would maximize a certain kinetic quantity that would lead to an optimal clustering quantity? So that's kind of the difference. So this is to set up the problem. Usually it's not to set microscopic, and then from the microscopic you can derive everything else. If you do it from the trajectory, it will be the same.
Hello. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. Um, Today I'm going to be talking about a recent paper called A New Approximate Eastern Canal Theorem. And so my talk's roughly going to be split into three parts. In the first part, I'll try to give a bit of background on what an approximate Eastern Canal theorem is and why we might want a new one. In the second part of the talk, I'll kind of discuss the methods that I used to derive this theorem. And this is probably the most relevant part of the talk to this conference. I don't work in complex systems, but essentially some of the tools that I use, entropies, are kind of actually interesting to some people. And finally, I'll give a couple of examples to put these kind of abstract theorems into some context. So what's the goal? The high-level motivation, we want to build a quantum computer for which you can run your favorite quantum algorithm on, and we want to do that even though, even in the presence of noise. So, as you may be aware, quantum systems, they tend to interact with their environments, and quantum information can get lost. And so what we really want to do is build a quantum computer that can operate in the presence of it. noise, and we call this the fault tolerant quantum computer. And so we're not there yet, but lots of progress is being made towards reaching this goal. And so what are the kind of main ingredients that you need to build a fault tolerant quantum computer? The first ingredient that you need is what you might call error-resistant quantum memory. So you need to be able to store your information in what's called a quantum error-correcting code in such a way that when noise happens, you can kind of correct those errors. So basically, what a quantum error-correcting code is you take your quantum state, your quantum information, you map it typically to some highly intelligent state over many physical subsystems. And this state lives in a kind of protected code subspace of a much larger dimensional Hilbert space. So when noise occurs at the physical level, by doing some sort of clever measurement, you can kind of detect, and then in the end you can kind of correct for those errors. And ideally, you want to be able to do this for all kind of states of the logical system. And so if we have a quantum error correcting code, we have a way to store our quantum information, we have a quantum memory, but we also want a way to process the quantum information that doesn't kind of introduce uncontrollable errors into the system. And so what we want for this is a set of kind of fault-tolerant quantum gates, logical gates. And essentially the simplest route to achieving this is to have gates which are so-called transversal gates. And what this essentially means is to apply a gate to your quantum information. What you do at the physical level in your block of code is you just address each of the individual subsystems. So, for example, each of your qubits, you address them individually. And what this ensures is that, say, some noise happens locally and destroys one of your physical subsystems, this doesn't propagate throughout the whole code block. So there's two things we want. We want a quantum memory that's resistant to errors. We want a quantum processor that's in some way resistant to errors. But there is a kind of stumbling block to achieving these two things called the Eastern Trivial theorem, which basically tells us that there's no quantum error correction code which can exactly correct the kind of local errors in your system, such as subsystem erasure, but also admits a universal set of transversal gates, so a complete set of unitary that are implemented in this transversal gate. So any approach to building a useful quantum computer must circumvent this difference. And so quite often when you have a theorem, the interesting things to look at are what are the implicit assumptions in this theorem that will allow me to get past this. And so there are a number of different options, and I'd say probably the most prominent one at the moment is called a state injection model, where they relax the assumption that you have a universal transversal set of gates. So you restrict yourself to transversal gates that implement kind of a discrete subgroup of the unitary group, typically a Clifford group, and you kind of upgrade to universality by injecting in a special class of states. But there are other options, and the option we consider today is relaxing the assumption of the ability to exactly correct for errors. So you might allow that at the end of your process after decoding, there is some ideally very small probability of error, and this will allow you to have universal transversal gates. And so the question we ask is does there exist a code that supports a universal transversal gate set which approximately corrects the logic? And so this is the setting of this is where approximately the kind of theorems come in, and there are a number of them in the literature. And existing approximate Eastern theorems provide necessary conditions on this problem. So they say if there exists such a code that admits a universal transversal set of gates, then the error probability must be bounded by some quantity. There are also some kind of works that have provided explicit constructions of approximate codes which support universal transversal gate sets, and all kind of families of codes and each of these provides like a specific sufficient condition for this problem. And so what would be nice is to have an approximately stable theorem that's both necessary and sufficient. And that's where this work comes in. before moving on to that, I'll also shout out this recent work, which is very nice, and they provide these kind of general necessary conditions on exact control fraction based on essentially the algebraic properties of different error models beyond erosion. So what's the main result? So the main result is that any quantum error correcting code supports a universal transversal gate set and can epsilon correct against erosion noise given by this channel if and only if this condition is satisfied, this inequality. So let's talk you through the different components of this inequality. So here is what's called a choice state. So essentially you construct this by, you have your encoding channel, you have your noise channel, and you just apply those to half of the maximally entangled state. So you can think of this as just a definition of bit notation. And so what's this? This is a conditional min entropy. So you take the conditional min entropy of this joint choice state. And essentially what this entropy measures is correlation between the logical Hilbert space and the physical Hilbert space. And to maybe put this in terms of entropys that people might be more familiar with, if you smooth this conditional min entropy and you take the asymptotic limit, where you take many IED copies of your state, this entropy converges to the conditional one-moment entropy, which is essentially, so the one-moment entropy is the Shannon entropy of the eigenvalues of your density matrix. And finally, one thing to note is that this conditional min entropy can be negative, and in particular for entangled states, it can be often negative. And the global minimum value of this conditional min entropy is achieved for maximally entangled states over the two subsystems. And this maybe gives a flavour of how we get the original no-go result. So for exact quantum error correction, we choose the error probability to be 0, and the right-hand side of this inequality becomes minus log d, and so you get the condition that the conditional min entropy has to be equal to this minimum, which means it has to be a kind of maximally entangled state. But typically this erosion noise will, pretty much always, it will destroy entanglement in the state. So this condition will never be passed when epsilon is equal to 0. So what are the methods that I use to derive this theorem? Basic idea is to use symmetries. So the Easton-Canill theorem expresses kind of a fundamental tension between continuous symmetries and error correction. And so the idea was to use kind of recent frameworks from quantum information where people have studied what are the consequences of symmetries on general quantum evolution. So let's kind of rephrase this as the following question. What can we say about future dynamics of a system that is subject to a symmetry constraint given some known initial configuration? And I'm a quantum information theorist, so I will rephrase this as what can we say about future quantum dynamics of a quantum system subject to a symmetry constraint given some known initial configuration, that's a quantum state. And so let's start with kind of unitary dynamics, closed system dynamics. How do we describe a symmetry constraint in this context? We say that a unitary implementing some dynamics is G covariant with respect to the symmetry group G if it commutes with the group action. So you might have some representation of your group, and each of the group elements has to commute with your unitary. So for continuous groups, Lie groups, this group representation is kind of generated by some observer. And we might ask, given some initial state psi, pure state of the system, does there exist a G covariant unitary that maps you to some target state phi? And an answer to this question is found by essentially Noether's theorem. So there exists such a unitary if and only if all the kind of moments of the expectation values of the generators of that symmetry are observed. And so so a natural kind of question is, which is kind of one of the first works phrased in this paper, is what about more general quantum dynamics? What are the consequences of symmetries when you don't have closed persistent dynamics? You don't expect to have conservations. And so how do we talk about symmetries in general quantum dynamics? So we have a quantum channel, which represents like a mathematical formalism, which represents kind of any dynamics that you can do in quantum theory. So you can write measurements in terms of quantum channels, you can write open quantum systems, dynamics in terms of quantum channels, and you can also represent unitary operations in terms of quantum channels. And a similar condition is applies for how you define G covariance in this context, that your channel has to commute with the group elements. And so we have a more general question. You have some initial potentially mixed state rho and some final target state sigma, and you ask, does there exist a G covariant, a symmetry design channel that maps you from your initial state rho to some target state sigma? In this paper, found an infinite set of entropic conditions under which such a transition is possible. So these are very nice. They're complete, but they're an infinite number of conditions. And so, drawing on this work, what would be the method that we used? So firstly, the insight is that when the output state is pure or approximately pure, which is the quantum error correction, just choose one of these entropes, evaluate one of these entropes to get your answer. And actually, this was first proved in this paper by Matt Labian in Supplementary Note 9. We have a mark, some consequence of that. And okay, the second step was to rephrase the original problem we had in correction in terms of this kind of perspective. And in particular, we see a unitarily covariant encoder, such that you could kind of recover your quantum information for every state of the system. And finally, to kind of apply these sorts of theorems, here we have a problem where you have to find a decoder that works for an infinite set of states rather than just one state. And so you have a symmetry constraint in quantum dynamics with additional linearity constraints. So extended these results to the general expression for general groups G is quite messy, but left to press the group of unitaries is quite a neat expression. I showed you earlier. So that was all quite abstract. I've got some examples. So one example is this so-called W state code, where you take your quantum state and you map it to this highly entangled state over any physical subsystems. And this is a kind of manifestly covariant code. It supports a universal set of transversal gates. And actually, in this case, we can show that our approximate Easton Camille theorem takes this very simple principle. And essentially, how this is derived is the original condition of an entropy theorem. It's stated in terms of a simple program. And actually, for this case, you can solve this analytically. So what we find is that this code epsilon correct for the erasure of capital N subsystems, if and only if this equality holds. And so we plot this inequality for different values of the number of every subsystem that your code can correct for. And so, for example, for 100 physical qubits, that's 3-level systems, you can encode one logical qubit and correct for single subsystem erasure up to an error probability of 0.05. And this is maybe a bit disappointing because actually you need error probabilities that are much smaller than this to be able to do something. I have a second example. So note the following axioms. Suppose the state of the subsystem S is has Hamiltonian HS. At some time t0, it can be described by a pure quantum state, psi 0. Second axiom, suppose that quantum mechanics holds globally across the universe. And third axiom, suppose that the global dynamics of the universe are covariant with respect to time translations generated by the system's happening. So I'm not going to make any comment on whether these axioms are true, but there are some theories where people believe these things to be true. And so if these three axioms hold, then some state psi t is a possible state of the universe for some length of time, t greater than 0, if and only if this single entropic condition holds, which is actually quite nice. This obviously isn't an experimentally accessible statement, but for example, if you found that the entropy of the universe at some later time was actually smaller than the initial entropy, then you could then reject what we call axioms. So to conclude, we studied kind of fundamental constraints on code supported transversal implementations of the Lee entropy. And so one kind of potential future direction would be to use the same kind of methods to provide constraints on kind of discrete subgroups of the unitary group. For example, the Fourier group is very interesting from the perspective of what's. And the motivation for doing this is that this might provide insight into kind of how to construct optimal codes within the state injection model that I mentioned earlier. And finally, we kind of identified this unique measure of asymmetry for pure states, and you might like to compare that to the role of the von Neumann entropy in particular asymptotic bipartite pure state entanglement theory. The role of the von Neumann entropy is a unique measure. So it might be nice to kind of explore this a bit further. What are the connections to the Noether's theorem, symmetric formulation, and there might be applications where symmetric kind of breaking is a resource, for example. So thank you very much for listening. Just a big shout out to my group, Quantum Thermodynamics and Computation Group. We have the same office as the complex systems people, and we were very nice. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It is an honor to be here. I've really enjoyed all the presentations so far, even though for most of them they are a bit outside my scope of knowledge and my scope of activity. I feel that it's kind of fitting that I'm somehow the last presentation and I'm doing a presentation about aircraft, since there are quite a few of you who will probably either today, tomorrow are going to fly back home. So hopefully I'm not going to scare you too much by showing you a bit on the process that goes behind designing the aircraft wings. But yeah. So this is your first warning. If you have a crippling fear of flights, you might want to switch off for a few minutes. But let's get to it. So this will be just an overview of the presentation. I am going to introduce airfoil, their parameterization, and their methods, and why are they important. Then I will just present to you some methods that are currently used in industry. This will be a very practical presentation. Then I will introduce our new method. We have yet to find a name for it, but we'll just call it our method. Then a very quick comparison in two different cases with two different classes of airfoils, followed by the results and our conclusion. So what is an airfoil? Well, in aerodynamics, airfoils are the quintessential shape. So whether we are talking about the shape of a wind turbine blade or the shape of an aircraft wing, we're talking about in section, or even if we're talking about, you would see on the bottom left, that would be the first part of the aircraft engine, that would be the compressor, or even the back wing of a Formula One car. These are all types of airfoils. These are specifically designed, well, they were specifically designed up until the 1920s or 1930s in order to get certain properties. Nowadays, engineers first come up with the desired properties, say the drag coefficient or lift coefficient, and then they try to find a mathematical shape that gives them the required properties. So what exactly is airfoil parameterization? So in here I have presented to you a Boeing 737 airfoil. This would be at the roots of the wings. So if you've flown with Wizz Air or Ryanair here, this is probably, this is what you've flown with. There isn't really an equation for this type of wing. If you were to somehow break into their headquarters, what you would find would be these points on the graph. That's basically because of the way that computational fluid dynamics is being done at an industry level. They basically just have very detailed simulations due to the fact that the Navier-Stokes equation, which governs basically any type of fluid flow, whether it's gas, water, it is a partial differential equation that unfortunately does not have any analytical solution. If there are some people with some mathematical inclinations to here, they're welcome to try and solve it. That would be that would probably lead you to a Nobel Prize. But yes, for the past century, maybe 2 centuries, us engineers have basically tried to get the most out of these unsolvable equations. Well, I say unsolvable, but there are some situations, some very limited situations, where you can find sort of an analytical solution, but we're getting off topic. This is parameterization. And what I mean by that is we have this number of points on a graph. Please note the different scale of the graph. In order to emphasize the curvatures, I have had to scale it a bit. Notice on the x-axis that we're going up to 100, and on the y-axis that we're going up to only about 8 or 10 or so. Otherwise, it would just be impossible to properly see what's going on. But basically, we have to find an equation for these very different curves. It's not a very regular shape. It's not like an intuitive shape. So there are very many ways that you can parameterize it. For a bit of spoilers, this is our method of this type of function. This ratio of 2 polynomials is the method that we believe can be used to improve upon existing industry practices. But first, I would like to tell you why is parameterization important. it's not about necessarily parameterization, but it's about optimization. Parameterization is the way that we do optimization. So for example, you will see in here that I have two different applications. In this case, there are airfoils for wind turbine blades. And you can see that for the root, the primary outboard, and the tip region, there are very different shapes. So there isn't one universal airfoil shape that will be universally best. For different applications, you want different airfoils. And so that's why optimization is very important. So in here, I have attached an example of a typical optimization strategy. So up until a couple of years ago, with the advent of machine learning and artificial intelligence, it was mostly done using genetic or evolutionary algorithm with a computational fluid dynamic simulation that would be to the left. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with genetic or evolutionary algorithms, but just to give a bit of an introduction, basically you would have a vector being your initial population of different parameters, say for our method just being the different parameters of the function, and you would have a fitness function for each of them. In our case, the fitness function would probably be the desired aerodynamical properties that we want. Let's say the lift coefficient, drag coefficient, those are generally the most important, but it can be even more complicated, like the whole pressure distribution. And then you would do selection. You would just take the ones that fit the best. You would do a crossover, so you would combine features from them in a multitude of ways. Then you would add some mutation, just changing on a stochastic basis some of the variables, and you would have a loop in which you would have a predetermined threshold at which you say, okay, I'm good enough. And then if it's satisfied, then you stop. If not, you just repeat the loop. Something quite similar is also with machine learning. If you can see on the diagram, you have different parameterization methods with like Bezier curves, B-spline, and so on. You will have your numerical evaluation. In our case, would be the computational fluid dynamics. You would then add an optimization model with your design variables, constraints, and you would do your optimizer, which is either gradient based or there are many other strategies. But for this presentation, we'll mostly focus on the left one with the genetic algorithm. This is mainly what we have been designing for, but know that all of our advantages also apply for a machine learning based algorithm. So I will just introduce a couple of parameterization methods. The first one being the class shape transformation is basically the most important, as it is going to be the one that we will be comparing our method against. Just very quickly about it, it has quite a low number of parameters, 6 to 20. The number of parameters is very important as it is one of our metrics, and if you've done any work with multi-objective optimization using either machine learning or genetic algorithms, you will know that the fewer the parameters, the much faster all of your simulations and optimization process is going to be. So at the industry level, NASA, Boeing, Airbus, they probably use CST, class shape transformation, because it's very flexible. There are loads, and there are lots of airfoil of different shapes that can be parameterized using this method. We will see which ones cannot be and what are the features that may impede such a parameterization. And it's very cost effective. You have a very low number of parameters. The algorithm is very simple. You just plug it in and you're good to go. There is also the parsec method. At first glance, it might have less parameters. It's very accurate, but it's not very flexible. You will see that there are some quote-unquote exotic airfoil shapes that really do not like this method. And then we have the Bezier curves, and that has a lot of parameters, but it's very accurate. But you're usually looking at around maybe 40 parameters for a single airfoil, which will give you a much slower, both a more slower simulation and a much slower optimization. And if your application does not need to be very heavily optimized. You just have the NACA series. These are some standardized airfoil shapes from the 1920s, 1930s, and that have basically been cataloged as like picking a standard model to which you already know all the different parameters of all of your aerodynamic properties and how it's going to behave. It's very good, it's very standardized, not very flexible. Nowadays, it's mostly used in wind turbine applications. So, yeah. Now, I would like to give a few more details on the class shape transformation, because this will be the method that we will be comparing our method with. So, it's very simple. You have your function, which will be y of x. This will be showing you how your aircraft wing section is going to be like. And it's mainly it's a product of a class function. In this case, the most widely used is this type with x to the power of n1 and 1 minus x to the power of n2. These define the general characteristics of the airfoil and the shape function. The shape function does define the actual shape of the airfoil, but it's usually just a sum of, it usually just uses a Bernstein basis or a polynomial basis. You can think of it as just a polynomial. This is great for smooth airfoils. This is very flexible, very compact, as in it has very few parameters. It usually needs less parameters than parsec or B-splines. Very important to mention is that when you see all of these parameters, you may think that N1 and N2 are parameters to be optimized. You would be correct, but actually for most airfoils, the industry just chooses N1 to be equal to 1 and N2 to be equal to 0.5, because this gives some very good general characteristics, and the differences are not that big. So here's our alternative method. Basically, we have discovered that this type of function, it doesn't necessarily have to be a ratio of a 4th-degree polynomial to a 4th-degree polynomial. It can have a 3rd-degree polynomial over 4th degree, a 2nd degree. It's basically ratios of polynomials. These, we have seen that they can be very good at representing a large number of airfoils, an even larger number of airfoils than CST, as I will show you to you in a minute. And yeah, so in a way, this combines the class function with the shape function. So that might be very useful in applications where you don't really know what type of class function you're going to need, as we will see in a minute. This can accurately represent quite a lot of airfoils. It can have, and the main advantage is going to be that we can extract quite a bit of knowledge if you from these types of functions. We believe that we can improve the search algorithm for solutions by focusing on the poles of this function. So yeah, let's. Oh, and also I need to mention that when we are going to analyze our airfoils, we are going to split the airfoil into the upper surface, also known as the extrado. I believe that might be a Spanish word, and the intrado, which would be the lowest surface of the airfoil. So let's talk about the metrics that we are using for this comparison. So, like many things in engineering, you will have a trade-off between speed or computational cost in this case and your accuracy. It's very hard to get both of them. Your number of parameters, you want them to be very low because you want to have very fast optimization. But we also need to have accuracy. So the metrics that we have used are the number of parameters. We want for them to be as low as possible, and we've chosen 3 different thresholds for our accuracy. We want the RMS error as a function of chord. I may have forgot to mention, but the chord is just the total length of the section. So if you were to go back, and here you would see that the chord is of length 100. I've scaled it just for the chord to be of this dimension because it just makes it easier to get everything in percentages. We have chosen a satisfactory value for the RMS error to be less than 0.15%. This is mostly arbitrary, but depending on the type of CFD software that you will use, you might want a less, might want to be more or less precise, but this is just a good industry level value. The maximum error as a function of chord, this is basically the same. because you might have, in terms of what turbulence model you want to avoid, this is going to a bit of a higher level computational fluid dynamics, but in terms of what model you use to actually model the atmosphere and what happens around the wing, very small, let's call them bumps or crevices in your function will lead to very significant aerodynamic phenomena happen. So for that, we want our maximum error as a function of code to be as low as possible, and we've chosen a value of 0.25%. And then the R-squared coefficient is just for the overall trend. We would only consider it valid if it's greater or equal to 0.995. This is again just because we need very high fidelity simulations. So first we will compare it with CST for quote-unquote conventional airfoils. When I say conventional airfoils, this is just your typical tear or water drop shape. You can see that it has a sharp tail and it has more of a rounded tip. This is probably going to be most of your airfoils that you might want to deal with. These are your conventional streamlined bodies, very good for lift, very high lift coefficient, very low drag coefficient. So we have this is just a very quick CST parameterization. This is for the top surface, for the I think it's for the Boeing airfoil that I've just presented to you, and you can see that we have chosen different n's, and here your n is going to be your polynomial order, so your number of parameters is going to be n plus 1. There is an argument to be made that the actual number of parameters is n plus 3 if you choose to also have n1 and n2 as parameters, but as I've said before, it doesn't really matter. We just chose n1 and to be equal to 0.5 and n2 to be equal to 1, and we're good to go. It won't really affect anything. We've tried doing the simulations. The only thing that changes when we actually try to optimize it is that you get 0.9999 instead of 0.9998 as for your R-squared coefficient. So it's really not that important. So what you can see is that in here, the CST parameterization model is very accurate, even with a very low number of parameters. So for example, having here your n is equal to 4, that would give you 5 parameters. With 5 parameters, you have basically described the whole airfoil. Sure, you can see that maybe on like the tip of the airfoil for n is equal to 4, you might have some deviations. So if you're, for example, working, I don't know, at the Pentagon, and you might be designing the next B2, yeah, maybe you want to use n is equal to 6. But with the metrics that we have chosen, we can really see that this is very low max error, very low RMS error, and very good R-second with a very low number of parameters. So this is the industry standard that we are trying to surpass. You can see that our method also has very small RMS error, very small second coefficient. But in this case, you can clearly see that we have 9 parameters, whereas most of the CST method using different values for your number of coefficients didn't really have that many. So in this case, we can confidently say that yes, our method is viable, but probably the CST method is just better overall. So yes, we can say that we have a comparable number of parameters. It performs slightly better in terms of precision, but the main advantage is that it has much fewer parameters. If you try to vary n1 and n2, you would get a similar number of parameters for the same precision, but again, it's just probably not worth it. So for this type of airfoils, it's probably best to just stick with CST. Now let's talk about some unconventional airfoils. And what I mean by unconventional airfoils is that if you look at the top surface, you will see that it has basically the same shape with like a very high tip that slowly goes off. But what I would mostly like to focus on is the bottom surface of the airfoil. You can see that there's basically an oscillatory term, and this is something that CST really does not like. And what I mean by this is that this is what you get with the CST. You probably can't see, but the actual points are the axis, which is basically a straight line. This is just, and if you look at the R coefficients, you would see that these values are just non-usable. You get very high harmonics, very high oscillatory terms because the class function is just very badly suited for this. Our method doesn't really care about that. We don't really have a class function, and therefore we don't really care if there's a bit of an oscillatory term. And you can see that with just 9 parameters, we get a very high level of precision with max error, with RMS error. So this would be an industry standard representation and parameterization for this. You might make an argument that parsec in this case might have less parameters, because keep in mind this is just the bottom surface that we use 9 parameters for. For the top surface, you would actually want to, if you use the same method, you also have 9 parameters, you might end up with 18 parameters overall. But then you might say that parsec has less parameters because you would only need 11, and you could probably describe this airfoil. The only issue is that you don't, for parsec, you might be able, you might not be able. It's not very consistent with these types of more exotic airfoil shapes. So it loses out a bit on consistency. So just a few conclusions on the comparison. You just can't use CST. The whole algorithm is, we also tried regularized CST with that. We tried varying our N1 and N2 coefficients. The results are just unusable. It really does not like this type of oscillatory forms for the bottom surface or even for the top surface. But our method doesn't really care, so it might be it will probably be best to use it when you don't really know which type of airfoil you might end up needing to use, so as to not lock yourself into a local minimum for your optimization function or a local maximum. But yeah, so for overall conclusions, we can see that for most airfoil, we either get a comparable number of parameters with a very good precision, but our advantage is that it can be applied to a much wider range of airfoils, meaning that your search region for your optimum solution is going to be much better. So this is just our image credit for all of the images used and our bibliography. And I would like to acknowledge my partners which have helped me in our writing this presentation and doing our research, especially Mr. Valentin Ioan Remus Niculescu. He was also supposed to come here to this Granada seminar, but unfortunately he was not able to due to the fact that he's just turning 80. He was here on last edition. He told me specifically that he sends his regards and he wishes that he was able to participate. And we would also like to give some special thanks to our late Academy Professor Șerban Țițeica from the Institute of Nuclear Research, Bucharest, and late Academy Professor Aurelio Emil Sândulescu from the Horia Holubei National Institute of Physics and Nuclear Engineering, also of Bucharest. Thank you very much for your attention. I will be glad to accept any questions you might have. They usually depend on your Reynolds number, the one that you're actually going to use, which that depends on your on all of your other characteristics like the density. So that's what changes from, say, air to water. One thing that also changes would be the Reynolds number at which the transition from laminar flow to turbulent flow is going to occur. So in a way, yes, it does. But at the same time, we have, in our database, we've tried for airfoils that have been optimized for laminar flow and also for more turbulent flows, supercritical flows, supersonic flows. But generally, for most applications, I would say that it doesn't really depend. Admittedly, there are different shapes that are used for water are a bit different because you have to take some other stuff into account, but the general idea is the same, and the region of the interval of parameters changes a bit, but the fit also works. Well, the way that we've actually done the model is that we have uh, we have looked at pre-existing airfoils data that is already in use for industry, and they do account for compressible or incompressible fluid. So basically what we have done is, and you can even look this up right now, there, if you search just airfoil calculator, there's a huge database of airfoils that are in supercritical laminar flow, slow flow, Stokes flow, optimized. And we just took this pre-existed airfoils in order to account for the different conditions. We just took a load of these very different airfoils, and we've tried to see if we can parameterize all of them. So we didn't. So the way that we approached this is that we went backwards from the result to see if we can get to the same result faster, in a way.
Okay, so it's time to close this 18th edition of the Granada Seminar. So I would like to thank all of you for coming, present your very nice research, and it was a pleasure for me to meet most of you, to have hard discussions, scientific discussions, and to learn a lot about this world that seems to be very complex. I think my view after finishing this seminar is that all of you have spanned the frontiers of knowledge about complexity. I hope you, my opinion, share also for you, and you enjoy the Granada Seminar, the presentations, the organization. I would like to say here at this matter, I would like to thank so much the people behind the scene, young people that help the organizing committee, in order that this edition had the success that I think it had. So my sincere thanks for these people. And I hope that you enjoy also Granada style of life. You enjoy the city, you enjoy the food, you enjoy the landscape of the city. And the organizing committee now is thinking in what will be the next edition of the Granada Seminar, the 19th, probably in 2 years, at which you are invited from now to contribute also for a good new edition. I would like personally, if you think you have felt good during this edition, that you share
this feeling with your colleagues at the university. And we are thinking for the next edition, maybe we are thinking many improvement. And for example, we think that could be interesting for the next edition to do an edition of a special issue in a good journal for the presentation in the next edition of the Granada Seminar. This is just to tell you that this is, I think this could be a good idea. So again, thanks a lot for coming, present your research. I wish you a good trip back for your home, and just hello, and hope to see you again, to meet again in other place, and in particular in Granada for the next edition of the Granada Seminar. So thanks.